Greeting to all from Seton Hall University in South Orange, New Jersey, USA. Wherever you are in the whole wide world, we greet you. With the hard work of Seton Hall University's Institute for Communication and Religion and the courtesy of Shamaru Entertainment, this program on religion in India is being simulcast to each and all corners of the world. My name is Dr. A.D. Amar or Amardev Amar, and I am honored to convene this event. I am Professor of Management in the Stillman School of Business at Seton Hall University. My expertise includes science and engineering, business and management, and operations knowledge and innovation. However, because of my birth and rearing in India, I have a special interest in this event on religion in India, the topic of this panel. The main religion in India, Hinduism, is the oldest religion alive, most complex and accordingly the most misunderstood, especially in Western countries. For these reasons, Pew Research Center undertook a study on religion across India that included about 30,000 face-to-face interviews with adults in India in 17 languages. All corners of India were included over a period extending 2019-2020 before COVID-19 and found out many very interesting results. What fascinated me personally is that the study found that the non-Hindus in India, such as Christians and Muslims, are different from their cousins in other countries. For example, these non-Hindus in India believe in the karma doctrine, celebrate the Hindu festival of Diwali, which is really the season that we are in now, believe in the special powers of the river Ganges, sacred to the Hindus, and revere one God with many manifestations. Findings of the Pew Research Center caught the attention of Dr. Jon Radwan, Director of Seton Hall University's Institute for Communication and Religion, who has been researching how ancient religious traditions inform contemporary communicators for the last 20 years. We thank him for the production of this event, bringing experts from the East and the West to help us interpret the survey results. Dr. Radwan will join us at the end of today's program to share questions on behalf of the audience, but first, let me introduce our two scholars. The first scholar who represents the religions in the West is Rabbi Alan Brill, PhD, Cooperman Ross Endowed Chair for Jewish Christian Studies at Seton Hall University and Director of Graduate Studies, Department of Religion, where he teaches these subjects. He specializes in interfaith theology and is the author of several books, including Judaism and World Religions, Thinking God. In 2014, Dr. Brill won a Fulbright Senior Scholar Award for research and teaching at Banaras Hindu University in Varanasi in India, where he taught 2 graduate level courses. His most recent book, At Rabbi on the Ganges, A Jewish Hindu Encounter, published in 2019 by Lexington. Our second scholar, Professor Anway Mukhopadhyay, PhD, is an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Karagapur, India. He was an assistant professor at Banaras Hindu University. So in a way, both our scholars today have connection with Banaras Hindu University. And he studied Hinduism, ritual, caste, and gender at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies in Oxford University. Dr. Mukhopadhyay's publications include The Authority of Female Speech in Indian Goddess Transition Tradition, published by Palgrave Macmillan, The Goddess in Hindu Tantric Traditions, Devi as Corpse, published by Routledge, and Literary and Cultural Readings of Goddess Spirituality, The Red Shadow of the Mother, published by Cambridge Scholars Publishing. His project entitled Achieving the Heritage of Hindu Spiritual Congregation in Varanasi is currently running at IIT Karagapur. He was honored by awarding him the Yuva Ratan Award, the Bharat Vikas Award, and university medals for topping the merit lists in BA and MA examinations. The questions that will be asked today had been developed and shared in advance with our scholars to ensure an information that can freely and collegial discussion of religion in India is taking place more than question and answers. At this point, I will pass the baton to our host, Bernie Wagenblast. He is a 1978 graduate of Seton Hall University's communication program and has decades of experience in radio and broadcasting. In addition to serving as the host of our Intersections podcast series on interreligious communications, he is professional transportation journalist and voice actor. And Shimaro is taking place in simulcasting this event and will be also joining us at the end. So I will rejoin you at the end of our program. Bernie, will you please greet our viewers and begin your interviews? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amir, and thank you all for joining us today. Again, I want to thank our guest, Dr. Mukhopadhyay, as well as Rabbi Brill. Thank you, gentlemen, both for being here today and what I'm sure is going to be a very informative discussion. I think the best place to start off, because not everyone who is watching this is going to be familiar with the Pew study of India and religion. Could one of you tell us a little bit about the study and why it's important, if you would, please?
Okay, I'm going to go first then. Is the idea of doing Pew studies of how we actually live religion, believe it or not, started with President Carter's term as president in America. The idea that we actually want to figure out when someone says they're an evangelical or something, what does that mean in the field sociologically? And in America, we've been very used to doing demographics of everything from what's an evangelical, what's a lapsed Catholic, how do they converge, what does a lived religion point of view mean? And we get the real divergences. You know, someone could say they're evangelical, but only 8% of them follow the tenets of the church. This is the first time such an approach to sociology has been applied to the Indian subcontinent. And it took actually 20 years to do. And I must point out, methodologically, it takes both it's not just taking surveys, but it then also means the interviews in order to coordinate the data and keep changing the questions to actually reflect what's on the ground. So this is our first serious survey from a sociological point of view of what people actually practice in the Indian subcontinent, and I'm sure they're going to update it in a decade from now in order now to answer all questions and problems they had on this first attempt.
Doctor, anything you'd like to add to what Rabbi Brill had to say?
Yeah, hello everybody. Actually, I think the most interesting thing about this survey is that, for us in India, it actually raises some issues which sometimes we thought we always knew. So when we first read it, it appeared that it actually vindicated some of the ideas that we always had. For instance, the interconnections between different religious communities in day-to-day interactions and all these things. And what is also interesting is that it actually vindicates, I think, some of the findings of this research actually vindicate what had already been opined by some of the sociologists and even the social psychoanalysts in India. For instance, if you think about the works of Ashish Nandy and the others, you will find that they had argued in a line which is actually vindicated by this research. So that's why I think this research is very interesting and important for us in India as well. Because, in a way, it sort of responds to some of our unpronounced queries, probably, and also some of the pronounced queries, which had been answered in certain ways by the Indian sociologists earlier.
Dr. Mukhopadhyay, you obviously are on the ground, so to speak, in India. I'm curious, from your perspective, do you think this Pew study accurately reflects the reality of what is going on in Indian society?
Yeah, now, that's really a tricky question, Barney, because, I mean, I will have to say yes, partially, and partially no. Now, the thing is that there are certain issues. For instance, India is such a complex and culturally variegated country that when you look at this country from one perspective, probably certain other perspectives might be missed. Now, this study has attempted to be as comprehensive and as inclusive as possible, but I think some lacunas are still there. For instance, if you think about the absence of ethnography, I understand that, when you undertake a research at such a large scale, it's not possible to engage with, ethnographic research. But there are certain issues which can come up when you engage in ethnographic research of the Indian communities. For instance, how do the different communities interact with each other in their day-to-day activities? For instance, one thing which I found a bit missing from this study is the detailing of the interactions of people from different communities within a sector which sort of houses the points of crisscrossing between religion and economy. In fact, in India, you will find various economic sectors which are connected with certain kinds of religious rituals or practices. For instance, if you think about even the city of Varanasi, you will find the industry of producing silk saris. And interestingly, this industry is run to a great extent by Muslim artisans and by Muslim owners. So in their day-to-day interactions, the Hindus will interact with them. And this study actually talks about the segregation between different communities, especially in northern and central India. But in the economic sectors, we'll find a very lively kind of interaction. They can't help it. It's required, because without that kind of interaction, the entire economy will collapse. And let me give you a very brief example. I mean, when this kind of sari is produced, which is basically a piece of silk cloth. So these silk saris are used not just for secular purposes, that women would wear the saris, but they're also sometimes used for religious purposes. For instance, the Hindu images would be draped with those saris, those pieces of cloth. So interestingly, even here you find that the religious rituals of Hindus would be dependent to some extent on this industry, which is run, again, to some extent, to a great extent, by the Muslims. So that is one thing. And I would like to mention another issue, since we are talking about communication in the context of religion. I think some of the terms that might have been used in this survey actually have multiple connotations, sometimes even conflictual connotations in the Indian context. So that might have been another point of slight miscommunication. For instance, if you think about the deities, for instance, there was one question on the preferred deity or the chosen deity, the Ishta Devata. Now, in certain cases, you will find that there is actually a constellation of deities that Hindu think about rather than a single deity. And there would be interconnections between deities. For instance, if you look at the findings, you will find that Hanuman is seen as a very popular deity, and Rama is seen as not such a popular deity. But interestingly, in the Hindu worldview, actually Hanuman is the is the disciple of Rama. So I mean, in some way, the moment someone is worshipping Hanuman, one's worship is also, offered to Rama. So there are these interfaces, but of course, there are a lot of things which are interesting about the survey. And especially, regarding the interactions between different communities. For instance, if you look at this survey, it appears that most of these communities hold the Indian identity in high regards. And I think that's a very interesting thing, because the ecological, it's not just about the politics, it's also about the ecology of the country. It appears that the ecology of the country has some kind of appeal to all of these communities. So that's what I find interesting.
You both touched on this, and I want to delve into it a little bit deeper. Obviously, doing a survey of this type in India is highly complex. You have, I believe, Rabbi Brill, you said 17 languages the survey was done in. Obviously, we're talking a subcontinent filled with people, and the technology is not readily available in all parts of the country. Comment a bit, if you would, about the methodology of how they did such a complex survey in such a complex country, and some of the questionnaires, and again, with 17 languages, does it translate well, asking the same question in 17 different languages?
Well, that becomes the question of any of the Pew studies, and the issue even in America. But this is why this took 20 years. They first had to do some pilot questionings, and they then had to back everything up with the conversations with people to make sure that we're meaning the same things. There's a difference between polling they do in a political situation is like, here's an exit poll in which there's no conversation, and here it had to be backed up with qualitative discussions in order to make sure that everything is calibrated. Now people are going to be looking over this data and looking where they could have refined the terms better, because they did not distinguish, for example, between prayer, bhakti, and puja as it's one category, and I assume that in 10 years from now, it's going to be 3 categories. There are things like that that they can, refine, but that goes on continuously. And then also it's taking in looking to where the random sample missed people. So to give you the American Pew, they're always worried about the small groups like Old World Mennonite or ultra Orthodox Jews. How do you make sure they're included if you're doing random sample? But once again, they are quite aware of this, and therefore areas they didn't think they were going to get to, they had to clearly target. There's a clear method here, and if you downloaded the results, there's a whole separate section on great detail on the method.
One of the, looking at this from a very top level, while it talks about acceptance of other religions, another one of the major findings is that there is segregation. Talk a little bit about that. How do we see that issue of segregation between various religious groups?
Should I go first or you go first? Okay.
Please go on. I will come in later.
Okay. So, first of all, that's the biggest thing the newspapers are reporting, rather than actually the biggest results that's tucked in there, because they want to make a headline. But at the same time, I'm giving you a story that when I came to India, I was told, look, everybody's got their place here. Here is, I was in a Hindu environment. Here are the Muslims. Here are the Farsi. Here are the Jews. You're Dharma Yahudi. You know where you fit in. I wore my yarmulke. There was clearly a place that everybody had their place, in which that is part of the understanding of reality that's so not American that anything it's going to show that people want to live with their own community makes no sense in America, where you have clear what's the word I'm looking for? where people can clearly, move around and have social mobility. There, people really live, and I lived in a group of entirely of professors of, whose families had been there forever, and that sense doesn't exist. So I get a sense that we've played it for the headlines more than actually an understanding, because when it comes to America, I don't think they really explain that part of what's going on. And it's different than America, where you just say anybody could be your neighbor, which is really not, and not for because discrimination, even though it's being played up for that, is it clearly each part of town has a very different role there. On the other hand, India is a country that is not particularly in favor of intermarriage and has anti-conversion laws. And in that sense, it's like any other ethnic country like Israel that has that same demographic. It's not America where, you pick up your religion in the morning. It's like very much your grandfather was this religion, you are this religion. And so, like I said, I think the American and British papers did not include that part. In America, what do I have the number here? 89% would have a neighbor of any faith, which is a very different. So you're really just comparing it to America than the world is large. On the other hand, since I was teaching interfaith in India, I spoke, because I was at a major university, I spoke to many figures who came from the Department of Defense and the State Department, who spoke there, and they all, because I was visiting, they all had to talk to me for a while. And they're all going, in India, we don't have religious difference, we only have social difference. And the issues are not because of one religion or the other, they have all sorts of very specific issues of classes, mobs, gender that do play a role, and not to ascribe it all to religion. I think that's something that the American write-ups play, and not to take us far afield. If you want to describe the tension between Palestinians and Israelis, you won't say is that it's Islam versus Judaism. It is clearly a geopolitical issue which happens to fall out by ethnic group, and I think that got lost in some of the translations.
Dr. Mukhopadhyay, I'm curious, Rabbi Brill was talking about how the US and British media reported this study. Was this covered much in India, and was there a different twist that they presented when they presented the findings from the study?
Yeah, actually, its reception differed in terms of the political ideologies to which the different media channels conformed. For instance, there was some kind of, very positive reception of this report by certain media channels which said that this report actually substantiates the point that India is a tolerant country. It's not an intolerant country, because in the West sometimes the idea is being floated that India has become intolerant and that kind of thing. So certain media channels said that it actually vindicated the Indian position that it's not intolerant and so on and so forth. There were some other media channels which tried to focus more on certain political aspects in this report, and they tried to say that there is a transition, but actually the point which I found missing was that there was not a comprehensive understanding of this report or a comprehensive analysis of this report. Because if you read this report very closely, you will find that, of course, it can be appropriated from different ideological perspectives, but actually it's not something which can be pinned down from any single ideological perspective. So if, for instance, this report doesn't tell you that India is intolerant, it does talk about certain cases of segregation, but at the same time, it also tells you the paradoxes that constitute the Indian psyche. For instance, it tells you that even the people who are apparently, willing to endorse somewhat conservative ideas are also of the opinion that religious diversity is something which is good for India. So it's not the case that, there are certain people who believe in exclusionary ideologies. Maybe their ideologies are somewhat conservative, but there is a difference between a conservative ideology and, say, an exclusionary ideology. So you may say that you don't want a person to be your neighbor, or that, you would prefer that person not to be your neighbor, but that doesn't really translate into, hatred or animosity. And as far as this issue of segregation is concerned, I think we also need to notice one thing, that is, in the context of India, we have to think about a very different kind of plurality, And this is something which has been observed by certain scholars as well. For instance, Robert J. Young says that Mahatma Gandhi used to focus on the concept of samasa rather than sandhi. So, in fact, in Sanskrit, you have two notions, samasa and sandhi. So, in samasa, two words get connected and conjoined, but they are not modified. So, they retain their own, shape. And on the other hand, in sandhi, which is another kind of process of joining two words, the words get together, but they also get modified. So if the sandhi kind of thing sort of gets to be seen as compatible with the melting pot kind of idea, then we have the samasa kind of thing. And in fact, the Pew Research report says that in India, you have a patchwork kind of plurality. But I think rather than seeing it as a kind of thali or patchwork, we can see it as something modeled on the basis of that samasa, where you have some incommensurable differences between different religious communities, which are retained rather than dissolved. So I think in India, there have in fact been some arguments on this report, and some scholars have pointed out some of the problems. For instance, this notion of segregation has been questioned in some of the cases of the media reception in India of this report, because people have said that segregation might conjure up very different kinds of images in the minds of the Western audience. So even if there is quote unquote segregation in the Indian context, probably it's different from the racial segregation that we think about when we think about slavery and all these things. So these debates have been there. And another thing is that some people in India, while analyzing this report, have also talked about the new findings which might come up if this kind of broad spectrum research is complemented by some kind of ethnographic research later on. And I think this report is not a finished thing, but rather it can be seen as a kind of work in progress. So much work can be done on the basis of this. And I think some of the Indian media channels have also hosted some scholars here, and they have indicated this possible work that can be done in the future. And of course, but more or less, I think the reception has been positive. In fact, there have been certain media channels which have said that this should be more widely publicized in order to sort of make sure that in a way there is no misconception about India. So a reality like that of the Indian society is bound to be complex. So that complexity has been presented by this report. So more or less, I think the reception has been positive. There have been some negative sort of responses, but otherwise it's okay.
Well, hopefully what we're doing today is going to be just a little bit of a contribution to making this more widely communicated around the world, in India as well as here in the United States and in other countries as well. One of the things that was touched on, talking about India as a secular society. Here in the United States, we've had a tradition for nearly 250 years of, or at least a concept of, a separation of church and state that obviously has not always taken place. Indian society, would you term it a secular country? Would you call it a secular country? Does that same idea of the government and religion being separate exist in India?
So if I'm going to go first, I think there's two issues here. There's religion and state. America has religion and state, but at the same time, separate, but at the same time, it's one of the most religious countries on earth, up there with Turkey and India. So they're different. India has high indices of both, meaning it's highly religious, and it believes that the state can get involved in religion, unlike the United States. So to go with the separation of church and state first, is here we have 64% of Hindus think that the politicians and the government should have a say in religion. There is still a point of coming to be of the tolerant society in which the state should get involved, meaning whether it's now going to say religious sites can be open to all people, which is a decree of the state. On the other hand, for the rebuilding of religious institutions, which is not allowed in America, they also think it should be done. And there, once again, we've got analogies better to Turkey and Israel in terms of the way this works. They don't think, rather than put it in clear terms, in the Protestant way in which religion can be of the heart outside of the political arena from everything else. Saying all that, we get to the other factor, which is actually religion. And in that, they've left it undifferentiated. And if I was actually going forward, would be to differentiate. But in the end, 78% of the country prays regularly. That's much greater than any other country out there, even than very pious countries like America or Israel. 78% pray. And of that, only people who don't pray or don't pray at all is like 9-10%. It's just so striking for having some sort of spiritual relationship. But once again, they didn't differentiate the different types of what that meant. That was the first thing I would have thrown back at them. Could you please differentiate that? But most strikingly is we've got 97% of India believes in God. That is an incredible statistic, and of that, 80% with certainty. In that sense, it doesn't correspond to anything we've got in Europe and America, because even in America, even if you are complete, Seton Hall Catholic, that doesn't mean 80% of those who are Catholic have complete certainty of God, or that the complete sense that you can assume that everyone believes in God on some level. And we've only got a very small percentage that are not certain about God. There's such a deep, deep sense of the divine, whatever word you're using, and that becomes where they're doing the check, that everybody has some. Once again, they use the one word God, which itself is an incredibly Western word, but from the interviews, whether they're using the word Parabrahman, Ishwara, Allah, that's what they get from the qualitative to show that people are basically, there is a common reference to what they're all pointing to. What throws the data off is that because this is a Buddhist question, because where the majority of Buddhists actually are hidden Hindus in the fact that they still believe in metaphysics, the soul, and God, even though the extreme Buddhists do not, they still have a third of the Buddhists who will deny any metaphysical principles, and that will throw the data off. And so you've got to, once again, if you read some of the better analysis, that had to be factored out, because somebody who goes to temple every day and prays every day, but in principle, because saying they're Buddhist, there's no God, is really will throw off the analysis. So there are small things like that those of us who know about religion in India can immediately read the data, and some have already picked up on on how to read it. I'll let my colleague continue.
Doctor, anything you want to add?
Yeah, so I have just a few things to say about this. As Professor Brill has rightly pointed out, when you put forward this question to the Hindus from different contexts, you need to be very cautious about the terminology because, I mean, there are multiple terms for God. But yeah, having said that, I would say that this report clearly says that most of the Indians are religious, and it also very clearly indicates that the real percentage of atheists happens to be very small as far as India is concerned. The other thing is that there are, two kinds of atheism here. For instance, on the one hand, you have something like a religious atheism, for instance, something that is seen in Buddhism. And on the other hand, you have non-religious kind of atheism, which operates completely outside the framework of any religion. So that is another thing. But yeah, mostly when we talk about secularism in the context of India, it's really one of the most debated and contested issues in India as far as politics is concerned, as far as religion is concerned, as far as society is concerned, because the Western model of secularism was sought to be tried and tested by some people, some political ideologues, and in fact, it has been written widely. I mean, it is something on which you have a wide corpus of critical literature in India. So the state is not really totally separated from religion, even though there are certain arguments which say that in classical India, there was a difference between the state and the society. So on the one hand, you have this notion of Samaj, and on the other hand, you have the notion of the nation state. So Gandhi himself insisted on the predominance of this notion of the society, and society having an autonomous space. That was the idea which was put forward by many other thinkers during the colonial period in India as well. But yeah, in reality, you can't probably practice the Western form of secularism here because there are so many religions, and the state has to take care of a lot of religious sentiments. So in that case, you might find some parallels between Singapore and India as well.
Related to what you've talked about in terms of secularism and such, I'm curious, in India, how does cross-religion culture manifest itself? People talk about wanting to stay separate in this report and some level of segregation, but I would imagine regardless of that, there is some cross-pollination between various religion groups, and how does that show itself in India?
So continuing our pattern here, is the cultures are very different. I must point out that if you read the websites of the Hindu temples in New Jersey, they will sound very American, and they will be putting everything into American Christian terms because that's the way you live. So too in India. The most noticeable one is where 77% of the country believes in karma of the Hindus, but notice only 77%. 77% of the Muslims also believe in karma. It means that is the universal language there for speaking. You'll frame things that way. The same way in America, whether you think like that or not, or even in the Hindu diaspora, you start speaking about suffering and self-help, which is not a karmic term, but you start speaking the language of self-help and overcoming suffering, which are American terms. The karma becomes a continuous frame, and that word, once again, did not distinguish because whatever people think it means, the broad range of definitions of cause and effect, or what goes around comes around, implied within karma, is a part of Indian subcontinent thinking. The bigger one is the reincarnation, in which, first of all, only 40% of Hindus accept it, and that backs what I've seen there, because most Hindu anthropologists of Hinduism and what I've seen there say we don't know very much about afterlife. Is you're bringing me things from the 18th, 19th, 13th century, and our 21st century business life as scientists and whatever doesn't really deal that much with afterlife. So we only get a 40% belief in reincarnation by Hindus, which itself is different than, Swami Vivekananda saying every Hindu must believe in reincarnation. On the other hand, you still have almost 30% of Christians saying they believe in it. Now, there is no place within Western Christianity for reincarnation, not since antiquity. There is no place in America and European for reincarnation, but 30% of the Christians, which show you how indigenous it is as a cultural marker more than it is a religious marker. The other striking one is whether you think the Ganges is holy, which 81% of Hindus do, but 26% of Muslims and 32% of Christians. It means if you live along the Ganga, you think of people treat it as holy, regardless of whether you're a Christian or Muslim. And we don't have a vague number like 32% of Christians think the Ganga is holy, doesn't really factor in those people who may live in the south or the extreme east who may have no connection to the Ganga. So if we got to break down by state, like in Uttar Pradesh or something, or to just that region, if the Ganga is holy, I'm expecting a much higher number even for Muslims and Christians, because that is the factor. Other terms, this is the part I did the most understanding of. When it comes to, first of all, the thing shows that when it comes to yoga, only a third of Hindus do yoga, even though the current prime minister is pushing it. But a similar amount of Christians are doing it. And that has so many cultural factors of identity and cultural heritage and why you do yoga. And it's already a very modern form, of yoga. And that's a cross-cultural. In terms of celebration of Diwali, the season we're in, that I knew from Jews who moved from India, is that Jews and others who were in cities that had Diwali did it because it was seen as a national holiday, the way we do 4th of July, Thanksgiving, and other such things. So I knew that Jews who lived in America and in Israel and elsewhere who were of Indian background, Diwali is a big part of it. Even Israel has put out Diwali stamps, because once again, at this point, we're blurring the lines between 4th of July and would be the equivalent of blurring the lines between 4th of July and Christianity. That yes, for a Vaishnava, there's real ritual to be done on Diwali in the temple. But that's not what people mean when they say Diwali. That means taking to the street and having a party, which is not the same word, and that really should be clarified going forward. The one final point that I want to bring up on this is the majority of Hindus, 61%, define that there's one God with multiple manifestations, multiple avatara as a understanding. What is interesting here is that 24% of the Christians had that same definition, that there are multiple manifestations to God, which you will never get in America. America makes everyone who comes here speak a different language. So to move back to America for a moment, many of the Hindu websites in America define themselves as monotheistic. However, whatever that is and whatever what means for a Vaishnava to say they're monotheistic on an American website, that becomes a cultural definition in the language of that country. And therefore, Christians can say they believe in multiple manifestations of God within India, because that is the predominant view. What is interesting demographically, and that's useful, that will change our American textbooks, is that only 7% of Hindus believe in many gods. That will change the textbook, because the official post-educated definition, self-understanding, is that many avatara, as opposed to those who are just singular. And therefore it becomes a very cultural understanding of what is. One final point on all of this is when you go to American textbooks about Hinduism, they give you such an essentialism of what is Hinduism. And it's actually this will forever change our intro to religion textbooks to basically say that no, Hinduism is not what it was in the first century, the 19th century, or even what it was in 1950. This is the current practice, and this is how you need to present it. This is what they really think. And then a lot of this is actually cultural understanding, because once again, we don't get up there and say, oh, Christianity is a religion that believes in many manifestation, many avatara, even though Indian Christians do. That essentializing has to be pushed for a greater ethnographic understanding of what is. And if I want to close with a story, is in Hindu public worship, there's a thing called arti, where you'll wave as lamps, lit candles in a certain way, and a certain wave of it as a public presentation. It's not a temple service, but it's public. And then there's fruit there, and then you'll tend to eat the fruit afterwards as prasadam. Know that Jews from India will use their Sabbath candles in a very similar way. They will do the same thing and the same bringing the light for their Sabbath candles. And unlike any other Jews in the world, Jews from India will put bananas and things by the Sabbath candles, and the first thing they will do after lighting the candles is not go to the Sabbath meal for the bread, the halot. They will eat the prasadam of the bananas after lighting the Sabbath candle. So there's a cultural realm here and a cultural mixing that's incredibly deep.
Doctor, Rabbi Brill talked about how a significant percentage believe that the ganja is holy. And I'm not sure if this is trying to define something a little too tightly, but do you think that there is a difference between those who actually view it as holy versus those who say it is holy as a sign of respect to those who believe it is holy?
Yeah, Barney, that's actually a very interesting question. And I would say, yes, there might be a difference. And, in fact, there are very interesting points of difference as well between the people, the practicing Hindus who might take a dip in the Ganga, and those who might not take a dip in the Ganga, but yet, consider it to be holy. And that is something which may be the case with many other, communities, many other faith communities in India as well. For instance, one might respect the holiness of the Ganga. It's also a kind of national river in India. So one might say that it's holy as a gesture of respect, because you can respect something in different ways. So ritualistically, one might pay this respect by taking a dip in the Ganges. But someone might believe that it's a holy river and yet might not take a dip in it. So there is a difference between a ritualistic acceptance of the holiness and performance of the associated rituals, and a belief in its holiness minus the rituals.
Anything you wanted to add, Rabbi Brill?
Oh, no, I'm good.
Okay. looking at this report and what the results of it are, do you see it contributing or leading to a sustainable policy in India that would facilitate interfaith negotiation? Dr. Mukhopadhyay, why don't you start off with that?
Yeah, thank you, Bernie, for the question. Yeah, I do think that this report can have different kinds of significance for the West and India, because for the Western countries it might be a matter of a redefinition of, or rather re-understanding of India, but for India it might have some kind of impact at the level of policy making as well. For instance, here we have had a very robust culture of co-survival. Here I am again, referring to a term used by Ashish Nandi, and a kind of hospitality. Again, he talks about it. So this hospitality has been a kind of central principle for shaping the Indian society, where you have seen conflicts. I'm not saying that there have never been any conflicts. There have been conflicts in the millennia-old history of India, but conflict has not been seen as more important than cohabitation. And that is something which is there, but unfortunately, this is not what we have included in our official system of education. Rather, in the secular, quote-unquote secular system of education, there has been some kind of, in post-colonial India, there has been some kind of deliberate avoidance of any reference to religion. As it were, you should push it under the carpet. If you talk about religion, then there is going to be some kind of trouble. But I think that approach needs to be rectified, and a renewed kind of interest in religion, not in a very conservative way, but in a progressive way. That can be the new sort of direction which we might take. For instance, there might be some policies in terms of multi-faith negotiation, interfaith negotiations at a very basic level. For instance, if we can teach our students about the heritage, the mixed heritage of India, and then if we can train them in the art of conflict resolution, because that is very important. There are conflicts, of course, in the Indian society, but there are also mechanisms to to address and redress such problems, and the UNESCO has certain frameworks for that. And in fact, if you look at the policy statement of the UNESCO Long Walk of Peace, which came out in 2018, you will find that in fact it talks about the possibilities that India can offer in the context of conflict resolution. And I think these new methods of conflict resolution might be taught to our students, to our young students as well, because after all, it's the new generation which is going to have the new India before them. So if they are taught to, number one, learn the nuances, the multiple nuances of interfaith dialogues, and number two, if they are trained in the art of conflict resolution, then I think we can have a more inclusive society, a more conflict-less society in that sense. So in that sense, I would say that it can have something to contribute, greatly contribute to the Indian society at the level of policy making.
As we talked about, this study took place over many years, but it's still only a fraction of time in terms of how long these religions have been interacting with one another in India and elsewhere. How can you put the findings of this study in a historical perspective? What does it mean from that perspective, either now or perhaps sometime in the future, looking back on what was discovered through this study? Rabbi Brill, you want to start off?
In a historic context, it's clearly saying we're now in a, I hate the word postmodern, but these aren't the opinions of the early 20th century, very much about having to do religious change or, modify from what were move away from traditionalism to what was called modernism. The results now show a certain point in which people are moving into set beliefs, diverse beliefs. No, things like temple worship are not going to go away. Things you might have thought 100 years ago. And that's clearly a big part of it. What comes out, I think it's a work in progress, because once again, the entrance into the middle class is not complete within India, and that's going to affect the change the most. With that, there was no differentiation, and most anthropologists of India on religion point out the biggest change, even in the last 25 years, and the study's been going on for 20, is how many religious institutions and temples are now run by the middle class and are serving middle class interests rather than state religious officials, traditional orders. It's entering into a more spiritual marketplace like we know in the West. And that's really, there was no differentiation, because that's one of the things you're really looking for our point in time, because that's the clear thing everybody's seeing. People will go less to some of the older, in older ones that were established by whatever, for whatever reason, under king and monarchies, and going now to things within their own suburbs to make sense of it. I think that is a very, that's our moment in time, and we're in a moment of process of seeing that change. The other moment, the historical moment here, is the role of, what's the number here, is the role, and we didn't bring this up, is that 60% of Hindus think you have to belong to the BJP to be a Hindu. That's a moment in current political history that you have, thinking that it's tied to a specific political party, which is not in the past, and I will probably not be in the future. And those are just a few comments.
Doctor, what would you like to add to what Rabbi Brill had to say?
Yeah, sure. So I would say that this report can be recontextualized within two contexts. So one is the diachronic context, the historical context, so how things have evolved before 1947. That is to say, before the political decolonization of India, the official decolonization of India, and also after that. So that is very important. For instance, we have one kind of political system now, but we had, apparently different systems before. There were also problems with those systems. So this report needs to be seen with reference to that larger historical context, that continuum of the history of post-colonial India and the problems. For instance, many of the problems that are emerging now, the epistemological problems, for instance, whether it can operate as a secular state in the Western sense of the term or not. Now, these debates, these issues, or even the issue of religious conflict. In fact, this report talks about communal violence and how many people have said from different religious communities, Hindus, Muslims, everyone, how they have said that it's a problem. It's one of the major problems. Now, if you look at the history of post-colonial India, 1947 till 2014, now BJP, that thing started in 2014. But before that, if you go back, you will find a lot of problems were there as well. And that is why I would say that within that historical context, you need to sort of contextualize this report. The other thing is that you also need to contextualize it within a comparative framework. For instance, if you think about the political and religious scenarios in the other parts of South Asia, especially, in contemporary times after the kind of resurfacing of the Taliban and all these things, then it is also within that comparative perspective that you need to recontextualize this report. And that's why I would say that on the one hand, there is a spatial kind of expansion that's required, and on the other hand, there is some kind of deep historical analysis which is also required. I'm not saying that this survey is problematic or that the findings are not acceptable, but the point is that they should be contextualized. For instance, why is it the case that many Hindus are talking about their anxieties and all these things? So what are the roots of these anxieties? Rather than passing any specific judgment on them and saying that they are all Hindu nationalists and that kind of stuff, one needs to look at the multiple and complex dimensions which are involved in this kind of emotion, because it is in a way a study of people's affect, people's emotion. And here particularly we are talking about anxieties, because in many ways we'll find that there are certain anxieties which are shared by many communities in India. So an in-depth historical analysis is required for that. And it's not just about the Pew Research report, but I'm talking about the analysis of Indian society and the Indian religious life in general. For that, I mean, all the sociologists, whether they're operating in the West or in India, they need to have a more kind of empathetic engagement with all these different religious communities, rather than passing overarching judgments on them.
Well, this past hour has been going extremely fast. I hope we've been able to touch a little bit more on this, but I'm sure some of our viewers are having some questions as well. So I'm going to turn it over at this point to Dr. Radwan, and he can perhaps share some of those viewers' questions with the two of you. I want to thank you both for taking the time to chat with me about this.
Thank you so much, Bernie. This has been so educational. I need to thank Rabbi Brill and Dr. Mukhopadhyay. Dr. Amar, who convened us at the beginning, will give a formal thank you at the end, but I really can't transition into audience questions without expressing gratitude. The context for this event is the Intersections podcast series sponsored by the Institute for Communication and Religion at Seton Hall University that I'm honored to direct. Our Intersections podcast series studies interfaith communication, interfaith relations, and the Pew Research study is just fascinating. It has so much data that asking questions is a challenge, but that's how we learn, right? So on behalf of the audience, I'd like to ask about the 40% belief in reincarnation, because here at Seton Hall University, one of my honors is to teach the Bhagavad Gita, and we read it in class. Some of my students are in the audience today, and the doctrine of reincarnation is crystal clear. But then when we learn about actual practicing Hindus in India from the Pew Research study, we learn that there's 40% belief in it. And so I would like to ask both of our experts if you could talk about this a little bit. Is this more of a personal choice and a decision, or is it perhaps ignorance of the tradition, or is it perhaps something else? And so please, Dr. Mukhopadhyay, can you please start us, and then we'll hear from Rabbi Brill?
So should I speak first?
Please.
Okay, thank you. So see, now on the one hand, it might be a case of ignorance for some people, because the research report, the Pew Research report, also clearly shows that as far as the Hindus are concerned, they are not probably in a systematic way trained to learn their traditions. I mean that's the implication which I got out of it, and that is true because in a way religious education as far as Hinduism is concerned, it's a bit lacking. For instance, I learned from Professor Amar that at certain hall the Bhagavad Gita is taught, but that is not something which you can do in the Indian institutions. That would be sacrilege, because they are supposed to be secular institutions. So there are these problems. So this is one thing. And secondly, when it comes to the practicing Hindus, you will find that the practical soteriology that they live with would often work even without reference to the issue of reincarnation. For some people, it's real. For instance, the notion of moksha, or final liberation, absolute liberation, that is seen as the liberation from the Bhavachakra, or the cycle of becoming. So reincarnation is actually synonymous with this process of becoming, continuous becoming. So but if you want to put an end to it, then you go for moksha. But interestingly, what we find in India is that in the popular culture of India, the notion of reincarnation has become so pervasive that there are films made on this theme, and there you have actually a very peculiar approach to this issue of reincarnation, where people would say that we want to be reincarnated, Because, if there is some kind of desire which is unfulfilled in this life, then we would like to get it fulfilled in the next life. So that kind of popular culture kind of approach to reincarnation is also there. But yeah, it's true that not all the practicing Hindus will believe it, or even if they believe in this, they might not see this as central to their own notion of salvation, or sort of moksha. Rather, let me use that Sanskrit now.
Don't hear muted.
Yeah, I was just saying thank you and trying to pass it over to you, Rabbi Brill. Could you please share?
Okay, so first of all, I'm going to start with a more shocking thing, that Rabbi Menashe ben Israel in 17th century Amsterdam, he was a rabbi basically for the age of exploration for Dutch Judaism, basically said that reincarnation is a pillar of Judaism, and if you don't believe in reincarnation, you're not really part of the Jewish fold. The difference between 17th century and 21st century is enough that no Jews believe in reincarnation anymore, even if it's in a text, because once again, it's not part of the American Jews' way of thinking. Putting that into context here, I don't think it's his ignorance as much as the fact that when you look at all the brand new Bhagavad Gita as a political manual, as a management tool, as a tool for self-help, reincarnation does not play the role. And anthropologists, and from my own conversations with people, is that becomes the unknown, the skeptic range, where in America people can say, I don't know if I believe in God or not. In India, you can say, I know nothing about the afterlife. And that's where the bone of opening is, even if 97% are absolutely certain that there's a God, but afterlife becomes the range. So it's not the way they're reading the Gita, especially if they picked it up in a political reading through Gandhi or some contemporary management reading of the Gita. I think that is their current point of where the skeptical range occurs. And people are now this worldly. As I mentioned, if you're entering into the middle class, you are really now, the other world is not part of your focus as you are trying to make it in the corporate world. And that's a natural tendency of sociology of religion to watch, very famous, the Weber thesis, in that you now have a this worldly asceticism rather than the otherworldly one of the Middle Ages. And that was part of the Industrial Revolution, is that the otherworldliness takes a back seat.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Brill. I just have a little bit of time for one more question. So the absolute certainty in God is at 97% according to the Pew survey.
80% absolute certainty, 97 belief.
Thank you. Belief in absolute certainty. It's really a very high percentage. And I think many Americans are more agnostic, right? That we aren't sure. And so how does that certainty play out in interreligious communication? If you're not sure about God, are you not sure about neighbor? And then if you're certain about God, are you certain about how to interact with neighbor? Dr. Mukhopadhyay, can you go first, please? And then Rabbi Brill, and we really only have a minute or two, but it's a question about religious certainty and how we interact with our neighbors.
So first, I take up this question on the certainty about God's existence. Now, if you closely look at the history of the conceptualization of God in India, or rather the divine, I prefer the term divine because I'm a specialist on goddess traditions, so I prefer that term. Now, you will find that here the evolution of the divine was different. And as many scholars have also noted, you find that in India, the humanization of God was one of the major themes in the Middle Ages. For instance, God was brought close to human lives, day-to-day human lives, mundane human lives. Now, that is why, this middle class or the day-to-day sort of, aspect of human life was not distanced from the divine, but rather the divine was brought close to the day-to-day lives. Now, when that happens, then naturally you grow a different kind of, idea about God, and you develop an idea that whether God is going to help you or not, that's a different question. But nevertheless, God is there. So God is conceptualized in terms of presence rather than absence. So if you look at, the Western tradition, then there is a focus on the absent God in many ways in modern times. But here, God was brought close to the mundane life of human beings. So God became this worldly rather than human beings aspiring for the otherworldly dimension of existence. So this is one thing. Now, the second question, living with neighbors, right? Yeah. Now, see, here again, I would like to address the question in a different way, not exactly, a sociology of religion kind of perspective, but rather a philosophical perspective as well. Now, if you closely look at the Indian culture, and if you look at the Hindu cosmology or the Hindu belief systems, you will find that it's accommodative. So here you have an accommodative consciousness, which can accommodate more deities at any point of time. So if you observe any Hindu home shrine, it's very interesting. You will find an altar, you will find a few images of gods and goddesses, but it's an open-ended space, right? So you can add more to it. And that actually translates, and this is something which springs from the belief that God might have multiple manifestations. And this extends to respect for other other forms of conceptualizing God, other modes of conceptualizing God, which might characterize other religions. So loving the neighbor or respecting the neighbor and respecting the neighbor's belief actually comes out of that. So it's connected to certain, deep belief systems as well.
Thank you so much. Rabbi Brill, can you respond?
Sure. Well, first of all, agnosticism is a very Anglo-American word that has to be in your language to adopt it. Two, the word God usually in America means a theistic looking down on you, whether you've been naughty or nice, this sort of conflation with other things, in which in India the word was taken in the most broad sense. When the Pew for America shows you that most people who say they're spiritual but not religious, or the nuns, believe in God, they're rejecting the God of their church, but they believe in the God of their spirituality. In India, the two of them are not seen as two different conceptions. It's a spirituality that I believe in the force that I'm going to merge through my yoga could be a very orthodox position in India, where it would be rather spiritual but not religious in America. And that's for an American to learn to read the data, or how much those of us who read Pews think the spiritual but not religious are, just keeping on really do believe on many levels, even though the American language does not allow it. So in that sense, that's the big issue here, because anybody who now believes in a force, there's something out there, is all underneath that word, which it isn't here. In terms of the relations, I think Indians have always believed in that we all share one, and I don't think that's not the new point. I think my colleague pointed it out much better in detail, that a lot of the issue now is learning conflict resolution and learning how to do the social, political, the fact that Americans play baseball with opposing teams, some sort of that conflict resolution on a social level rather than being separate is really the issue, not the concept that we all have one God behind us.
Thank you so much for bringing that back to conflict resolution, Rabbi Brill. The idea of healthy interfaith communication has to be aimed toward peace. And events like this help us learn about different traditions, and knowledge is the first step. It's imprudent to enter into interreligious dialogue without knowledge. And so I thank both of our guests, and I'm happy to turn it over to our convener, Dr. Amar, to give the formal closing to our wonderful event today. Thank you all.
Thank you, John. It has been our privilege to have these two experts come and talk about this difficult subject. Pew Research obviously is better than no research. And so in that regard, we would say it was a good contribution. And in my observation, I'll say the biggest integrator of Indians is God. That's why 97% believe in God. And that means they also say all religions lead to God and all religions are good. And with that, I will conclude this session. And I have thanks for Shamaru. And Shamaru had a little message, and I'm just going to project their insignia as a way for us to say that whatever they did for us, in fact, is appreciated. All right, I guess technical difficulties, but we do convey our thanks to Shamaru and thanks to both our speakers and Dr. Radwan and Bernie Wagenblast. Thank you so much. Bye.